May 8, 1942. Coral Sea, South Pacific. 11:19 hours. Lieutenant Commander John Buckmaster, 44, captain of USS Yorktown, felt his carrier shudder as an 800-pound bomb penetrated 3 decks before exploding deep inside the ship. Smoke poured from the wounded vessel. Fire spread through crew quarters. The Japanese strike force that hit her withdrew, pilots reporting 1 American carrier left burning and certainly lost. But those pilots didn't understand what made American carriers different. It wasn't armor. It wasn't guns. It wasn't even the aircraft they carried. It was 1,400 sailors who trained for a mission their Japanese counterparts barely practiced. A mission called damage control. What happened next aboard Yorktown, and later aboard other American carriers that should have sunk but didn't, would puzzle Japanese naval engineers for the entire war. How did American carriers survive hits that would sink Japanese ships? The answer wasn't in the steel. It was in the training. By May 1942, carrier warfare had evolved from theoretical concept to decisive reality. The Battle of Coral Sea marked the first naval battle where surface ships never saw each other. Aircraft were now the primary weapons. Carriers were the capital ships, and keeping carriers operational after damage was the new survival skill. Japanese naval doctrine emphasized offensive striking power above all else. Carriers were designed to launch massive strikes quickly, overwhelm enemy defenses, and achieve victory through superior attack capability. This philosophy produced the most capable carrier strike force in the world by 1941. 6 fleet carriers of the WWII could launch 350 aircraft in a single strike. No navy could match that concentrated offensive power. But offensive emphasis came with trade-offs. Japanese carriers had minimalist damage control organizations. On a typical Japanese fleet carrier, maybe 20 sailors were specifically assigned to damage control duties. The rest of the 1,500-man crew had combat roles. Damage control training was basic. Fight fires, pump out water, maintain buoyancy. The assumption was that carriers either avoided being hit through superior tactics, or they were so heavily damaged that survival was impossible anyway. American carrier doctrine evolved differently. The Navy analyzed British carrier experiences in the Atlantic and Mediterranean through 1940 and 1941. Those reports showed that carriers could absorb tremendous damage and survive if damage control was effective. The British carrier HMS Illustrious, hit by German bombs in January 1941, stayed operational and made it to port despite severe damage. The lesson was clear. Ships don't sink from damage alone. They sink from uncontrolled damage. USS Yorktown, commissioned in September 1937, was one of the Navy's first purpose-built fleet carriers. By 1942, Yorktown had 6 dedicated damage control teams totaling approximately 300 sailors. Every department contributed additional personnel to damage control stations when needed, bringing total damage control capability to over 400 sailors during battle conditions. These men trained constantly. Not just the damage control teams, but everyone aboard. Damage control drills happened weekly. Simulated fires, simulated flooding, simulated power loss, simulated communications breakdown. Teams competed against each other for fastest response times. Department chiefs rated damage control performance alongside combat effectiveness in fitness reports. Excellence in damage control could advance a Navy career as surely as excellence in gunnery. The training paid off on May 8, 1942. When that Japanese bomb exploded deep inside Yorktown, killing or wounding 66 men, damage control teams reached the fire within 2 minutes. They'd trained for exactly this scenario dozens of times. Every man knew his station, his equipment, his mission. Within 7 minutes, the main fire was contained. Within 20 minutes, it was under control. Within 2 hours, Yorktown was recovering aircraft again. The Japanese pilots who hit Yorktown reported a carrier left burning heavily, certainly out of action. They'd seen smoke pouring from the ship and assumed, based on Japanese experience, that such damage was catastrophic. They were wrong. Yorktown withdrew from Coral Sea under her own power, ready to fight again. But the real test came 3 weeks later at Midway. May 27, 1942, Yorktown limped into Pearl Harbor. The damage from Coral Sea was severe. The shipyard commander, Rear Admiral Chester Nimitz, asked how long repairs would take. The initial assessment was 90 days in dock. Yorktown needed new structural supports, new electrical systems, new ventilation, and comprehensive systems testing before returning to action. Nimitz gave them 3 days. The Battle of Midway was coming. Every carrier mattered. Make Yorktown ready or accept defeat. What happened at Pearl Harbor Navy Yard over the next 72 hours became legendary. 1,400 civilian shipyard workers swarmed aboard Yorktown. They worked around the clock, welding new steel, running new cables, testing systems without shutdown. Work crews changed shifts. The work never stopped. Welding sparks flew 24 hours straight. Supply trucks arrived every few hours with materials. No requisition was too difficult. No request denied. After 72 hours, Yorktown wasn't fully repaired, but she was operational. Good enough to fight. She left Pearl Harbor on May 30th with 127 civilian workers still aboard, finishing repairs during the voyage to Midway. Some welds were still cooling when Yorktown launched aircraft on June 4th. At Midway, Japanese dive bombers hit Yorktown 3 times. Bombs penetrated the flight deck, started fires, caused severe damage. Japanese pilots again reported 1 American carrier left burning, surely lost. But Yorktown's damage control teams went to work. They fought fires while bombs were still hitting. They jury-rigged repairs with whatever materials existed aboard. They restored flight operations twice after being knocked out. Yorktown stayed in the fight for 8 hours after the first bomb hit. The ship finally succumbed not to air attack, but to torpedoes from Japanese submarine I-168 2 days later. Even then, Yorktown took 2 torpedoes and stayed afloat for another 12 hours before finally sinking on June 7th. An American destroyer alongside her, USS Hamon, was also torpedoed and sank in 4 minutes. Same torpedoes, same ocean. One ship sank in minutes. One ship stayed afloat for hours after absorbing multiple torpedo hits. The difference was damage control, capability designed into every system, Japanese. Naval officers studied reports of American carrier survivability with growing concern through 1942 and 1943. How did Yorktown survive at Coral Sea with damage that should have disabled her? How did she fight at Midway after being hit 3 times? Other examples multiplied. USS Saratoga, torpedoed twice in separate incidents, survived both times. USS Enterprise, hit by bombs multiple times, always returned to action within hours or days. Meanwhile, Japanese carriers proved frighteningly vulnerable. At Midway, all 4 Japanese fleet carriers present were sunk. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu all succumbed to uncontrolled fires after bomb hits. Hiryu survived initial damage, but fires spread beyond control, forcing abandonment. American bomb damage initiated the losses, but inadequate damage control turned damage into destruction. Japanese naval intelligence reports from late 1942, recovered after the war, noted American damage control capabilities with obvious concern. One report, dated November 1942, analyzed the difference. American carriers demonstrate unusual resistance to battle damage. Fires that would prove catastrophic aboard our vessels appear to be controlled quickly aboard American ships. We initially attributed this to superior materials or construction techniques. Interrogation of captured American sailors reveals different explanation. Americans train entire crew in damage control procedures. They conduct extensive damage control drills regularly. They have large specialized damage control teams. They have extensive firefighting equipment distributed throughout their ships. Most significantly, damage control is treated as equally important to offensive operations in American naval culture. The report recommended immediate expansion of Japanese damage control training and organization. Some changes were implemented. Additional fire extinguishers were distributed to ships. Damage control teams were slightly enlarged. But fundamental transformation never occurred. Resources were limited, training time was precious, and the offensive-minded culture of the Imperial Japanese Navy resisted devoting substantial effort to what was seen as defensive, passive activity. The cost of this choice became clear throughout 1944 and 1945. USS Franklin, March 19, 1945, suffered perhaps the most severe damage any American carrier survived in the entire war. A single Japanese dive bomber penetrated the combat air patrol and dropped 2 bombs on Franklin's flight deck, while the carrier was preparing a strike. Both bombs hit among fully fueled and armed aircraft spotted on deck. The resulting explosions and fires killed 724 men immediately, wounded hundreds more, and left Franklin's flight deck a burning wreck. The damage was catastrophic. Fires burned at 2,000 degrees. Ammunition cooked off. Whole sections of the ship were inaccessible due to fire and smoke. The ship listed 13 degrees. Power failed. Communications failed. Franklin appeared finished, but damage control teams kept fighting. With the primary firefighting mains destroyed, they ran hoses from whatever water sources they could find. When pressure failed, they formed bucket brigades. They threw burning ammunition overboard by hand. They cut away burning wreckage with axes and cutting torches while fires raged around them. They worked for 36 hours straight without relief. Franklin survived. She was towed part of the way, but eventually steamed under her own power, crossed the Pacific, transited the Panama Canal, and reached the Brooklyn Navy Yard for repairs. She'd absorbed damage that would have sunk 3 ordinary ships. Her survival was attributed directly to damage control training and determination. Japanese carriers facing similar damage simply didn't survive. Taiho, June 19, 1944, was Japan's newest, most advanced fleet carrier, heavily armored, incorporating lessons from earlier losses. She was hit by a single submarine torpedo that ruptured aviation fuel tanks. The damage was serious but not immediately catastrophic. But fuel vapors weren't properly ventilated. Damage. Control teams didn't recognize the danger building below decks. 7 hours after the torpedo hit, accumulated vapors exploded. The explosion was massive. Taiho sank rapidly. Over 1,600 men were lost. 1 torpedo. 7 hours to control the situation. Failure to do so cost Japan her best carrier and most of her crew. American carriers had been hit by torpedoes dozens of times by mid-1944. Most survived because damage control teams understood fuel vapor dangers, because ventilation systems were designed to clear dangerous gases, because training emphasized controlling secondary damage as much as primary damage. The systematic difference in damage control philosophy produced measurable results. During World War II, 15 American fleet and light carriers were hit by Japanese bombs, torpedoes, or kamikaze aircraft. Of those 15, only 4 were sunk. 11 survived, were repaired, and returned to action. Of Japanese fleet and light carriers hit by American weapons, 19 out of 20 sank. The single survivor, Zuikaku, survived bomb damage at Coral Sea, but was sunk at Leyte Gulf. No Japanese fleet carrier hit in combat ever returned to full operational status. The difference wasn't in armor thickness or structural strength. American carriers generally had lighter armor than Japanese carriers of equivalent size. The difference was in training, organization, and culture. Americans treated damage control as a core warfare capability. Japanese treated it as an emergency procedure. After the war, Japanese naval officers who survived were interviewed by American naval intelligence. Many interviews focused on damage control. The common theme in their responses was surprise at American damage control effectiveness. Several officers mentioned that they'd assumed American survivability came from superior materials or secret technologies. The reality that it came from training and organization seemed almost disappointing to them. Commander Hisashi Yokota, who served aboard carrier Shokaku until her sinking in June 1944, gave particularly detailed testimony in 1946. He'd studied at the U.S. Naval Academy before the war, had American friends, spoke English fluently. His perspective bridged both naval cultures. I saw Shokaku die from 3 submarine torpedoes. The first torpedo wasn't fatal, but we couldn't control flooding. Systems failed. Confusion spread. The second and third torpedoes doomed us. I thought this was simply bad fortune. After the war, studying American carrier operations, I understood differently. American carriers were hit by torpedoes many times. Most survived because their crews knew exactly what to do immediately. Our crews were brave, determined. But determination without training and organization isn't enough. Americans made damage control a science. We treated it as an art practiced during emergencies. That difference decided which carriers lived and which died. Yokoda's observation extended beyond carriers. It applied to organizational resilience generally. When crisis hits, organizations that have trained for crisis, planned for failure, and practiced recovery repeatedly will outperform organizations that assume crisis won't happen or can be overcome through determination alone. Today, every navy in the world studies American damage control methods from World War II. The curriculum at naval training centers worldwide includes specific examples from Franklin, Yorktown, and Saratoga. Not as history, but as operational doctrine. The principles haven't changed. Assume damage will occur. Train everyone, not just specialists. Make resilience a core capability, not an afterthought. The United States Navy Surface Warfare Officers School in Newport, Rhode Island, dedicates an entire week of training to damage control. New officers fight simulated fires in controlled burn facilities. They practice shoring bulkheads, stopping flooding, restoring power while wearing breathing gear in smoke-filled compartments. They learn that damage control isn't about preventing damage, which is impossible in combat. It's about controlling damage once it happens, limiting its spread, maintaining combat capability despite it. At the USS Yorktown Museum in Charleston, South Carolina, a different Yorktown, CV-10, commissioned after CV-5 sank, visitors can tour Damage Control Central. The space is filled with diagrams showing every compartment, every system, every watertight door. Guides explain that this room was the brain of damage control operations. From here, officers tracked damage, directed teams, made decisions about where to fight fires or accept losses to save the rest of the ship. School groups touring the ship often express surprise that so much space and so many people were dedicated to damage control. They expect carriers to be all about aircraft and weapons. The guide's standard response has become famous among frequent visitors. A carrier that can't survive damage can't deliver sustained offensive power. The side that keeps its carriers operational longest wins. That requires treating survival as equal in importance to striking power. Americans understood this. It wasn't glamorous. Nobody got medals for running better damage control drills. But when bombs hit and fires started, those drills saved ships and lives. There's a principle in engineering called graceful degradation. When systems are damaged, they should degrade, gradually, losing capability slowly rather than failing catastrophically all at once. This principle allows continued operation despite damage, buying time for repairs or withdrawal. American carriers were designed for graceful degradation, multiple backup systems, redundant power sources, damage control capability distributed throughout the ship rather than concentrated in one location. Japanese carriers generally lacked this resilient design philosophy. Systems were optimized for maximum performance, not maximum survivability. When primary systems failed, ships quickly became helpless. This wasn't stupidity or poor engineering. It was a deliberate choice based on different assumptions about naval warfare. The Japanese assumed battles would be decided quickly by superior striking power. Americans assumed battles would be sustained affairs, where surviving damage mattered as much as inflicting it. Both assumptions were logical given each navy's strategic situation and resource constraints. But only one proved correct in practice. Pacific carrier warfare became a grinding campaign of attrition. The the side that could keep carriers operational. Despite damage, that could repair ships quickly and return them to battle, held enormous advantages. America's industrial capacity allowed new ship construction. But even with that advantage, keeping damaged carriers operational shortened the war by months compared to waiting for new construction. The human stories behind damage control statistics deserve remembering. Lieutenant George Worth, 28, was a damage control officer aboard USS Enterprise during the Battle of Santa Cruz in October 1942. Enterprise was hit by 3 bombs in 10 minutes. Worth's damage control team was fighting fires on the hangar deck when a 4th bomb hit directly above them. 15 men in Worth's team were killed instantly. Worth was wounded but stayed at his post, directing surviving team members until the fires were controlled. Enterprise stayed operational. Worth survived, received the Navy Cross, and served through the rest of the war. He rarely spoke about damage control. His family learned details only after his death in 1987, when his service records were donated to the Naval History and Heritage Command.